All right, we are back, picking up right where we left off. Let's go.
Has been really, really impressive and really, really like a joy to be a part of, right? So yeah, we've gotten pretty big. I think it's probably safe to say that we have probably gone from being like a D-list internet project to maybe a low B-list internet project. I think it just
Yeah,
surprised me the
and
most over time.
everybody understands what happens when you get too popular and you get mainstream and you sell out. There's no punk left in it, and that's really what the SCP Wiki is now. It's just a sad thing to see. And that's fine. That's inevitable at some point. I mean, the success isn't a bad thing because, someone has to, be the spear tip, into the greater cultural consciousness. But that does mean that there are always going to be those of us who are ready to catch the falling genre and bring it back to where it once was prior to this massive, massive dilution of quality and intent and goal and ideals that we've seen happen at SCP Wiki.
How people have started to come around, not necessarily come around to the idea of, but like being introduced to the wiki without me knowing about it. Like when the Volgan, everybody knows the Volgan. He does videos about articles written on the wiki. He and I collaborated loosely on a video that he did about one of my articles a couple of months ago. And when I was showing it to my family, because they know kind of what I do here, my youngest brother knew about it right away. And he's like, "Oh, I had no idea that you wrote that thing. I know all about this thing." Right?
Must be the
That
bodies
is
in the
crazy
water
to me
thing,
because it is weird to me that people know about
which
this
is
without
great.
having to be told
Awesome
about it.
mimetic hook there.
So I've really I have enjoyed my time here. I've been here a long time. I plan on being here for a long time.
Damn
but
it.
it is a very cool, very unique project that just I
Yes,
don't
it is.
believe that there's anything else like it anywhere else on the internet.
No, you're right.
I could not agree more.
Mm.
And so that's why people like me, some people can't understand why someone would be so bothered by what happens and what is happening to the SCP Wiki. Well, it's really a function of how important I think this is. I think he's absolutely right. I think the SCP Wiki is totally unique. There's some qualities about it that just nothing else has. There are good things and bad things about that. But I think it's something really special. I really, really do. And I think it's so special that it shouldn't be equated with SCP Wiki. I think that it's bigger than SCP Wiki. And so that's what containment fiction is. And that's why we're doing this, is because it is bigger than SCP Wiki. They don't like to admit that. They don't like to look at that. They don't want to acknowledge that, which is fine. I mean, that doesn't stop anything from happening. It doesn't stop the umbrella genre from growing, which is what is happening. And they're becoming a relatively smaller part of it, a relatively less dominant part of it with every week. But I do think that, this is something that's worth spending a lot of time doing things over, like this, what I'm doing now.
And into it. How long have you been here?
I guess it's two different answers. So I got into it in 2012. I got linked I was linked to SCP-087, which is the staircase on Reddit in 2012 when I was in college. And I was enraptured, like from the word go. Like it was.
That's really something that a lot of us have in common with containment fiction. Is the first time you get across it, it's just like, it's so different. It's so different. It's such a fresh breath of fresh air, which is why it's worth preserving and why it's worth speaking out when people are ruining it.
It was one of those things where you didn't, I wasn't one of the people who like started reading articles and like, oh my gosh, this is real, and my eyes have been opened. It was never that. It was more, it was a genre of fiction that was set like well into my wheelhouse, right? Like I really enjoyed kind of bite-sized horror fiction and bite-sized weird fiction,
which it has not. It's become something other than that. djkaktus once again is sort of one of the godfathers of moving away from concise, succinct, aphoristic styles of writing when it comes to the genre, which was its initial intention. But now, basically, it's taken notes, it's making compromises with other forms of writing, particularly very narrative-heavy ones. And I've said this a lot, it's a lot harder to write very lean, very muscular containment fiction, denying yourself the reliance on those old, tried and true and more traditional and tired forms of tools, literary and compositional tools, like what we see all over the SCP Wiki today, it's much harder to write a real containment fiction article. It's a lot easier to just write a narrative and a fan fiction and slap, SCP on it or something like that.
And even some of the articles that were longer at the time, like SCP-093, which is the Red Sea object, was the first article that I read that I was like captivated by, right? And a lot of people feel that way about those kind of early articles. There was something, everybody always talks about how there's always one that grabbed you. For me, it was 093, and then later another one called 455. That is the cargo ship. Those were the first two that really like reached out and kind of got me around the neck. And
So why is it that I guess Series 1 is still the most culturally dispersed? You don't really see a lot of people who come in and be like, oh yeah, my first article was SCP-6 blah 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 blah, and it captivated me and enraptured me. It's like that doesn't really happen as much. I'm sure it does happen. I'm not going to count it out completely, but it still seems that what he's saying is true. You'd think that it would be a remnant, a vestigial thing from past authors who just had those first series available to them, but it's still the case now.
I was obsessed at the time. And then I went to create an account on the wiki, and I messed it up. I didn't put in the right information, and my account was rejected. And I was so embarrassed by it, I didn't come back for 2 years because I was like, "Oh my gosh, they know that I've done this horrible crime." And what's really funny about it,
they do keep a permanent record on you.
Is I'm pretty sure that me being gone for those 2 years is the reason why I'm djkaktus now and not Dr. Benjamin, because that was the first account I applied under, was Dr. Benjamin.
Ooh.
Which
I'll say this. It's almost like watching a house being built when you enter a community and get to know it and get to know the people in it. And it's weird when you're in it, when you've been in it for a long time. And of course, these names, the djkaktus, names like this. Of course, I mean, it's just so familiar to you. But at one point, they were kind of like the house without the walls, just the studs up and framing up. And it's weird to, once you're in a house that's totally built and fleshed out, go back and think of how it was when you saw it just with the framing up. That's kind of what the case was with someone like djkaktus. When I first heard djkaktus and I started, slowly realizing that this was somebody of some importance in the community, the name to me was like, that guy, like djkaktus is the name of this important guy, like weird. Like usually, I don't know, it was a little bit of a paradigm shift for me, because usually it's like, I don't know, I expected for some reason for popular people, important people to have like, good names. not that djkaktus is a terrible name. It's just I like it though, because if you can take a name that's, maybe a little unassuming and kind of a little goofy and make it something that people revere, I think that's pretty cool, actually. I think that's more cool than, a cool name, which kind of might have some of that already baked into it.
With the benefit of hindsight,
there's something there.
So when I came back in 2014, I don't know why I came back. I had been kind of reading the wiki kind of off and on for those, in that period of 2 years. And I got pretty familiar with not just, the stuff that was written on the wiki, but I followed the 05 wiki too, which is the staff website. And I kind of followed, the discussions that were happening there.
See, that's interesting. So we talked a little bit in the first part of this about marketing strategies and how crucial that is to, like anything, but certainly to the SCP Wiki now. I think there are people who are writing for the wrong reasons there. Most people are, I think. And Dr. Gears, by the way, agrees with me, incidentally. But yeah, so it's one thing to be so specialized in this space. The products that I am involved with, the Confic Wiki, the Confic magazine, these videos, the YouTube channel videos, all this is just, it's such a small, narrow sliver of a relatively obscure demographic. You are rarely going to see people in the SCP space, in the containment fiction space, who read 05 like the way djkaktus just mentioned he used to. Very few people. Like I would guess maybe, I don't know, I want to throw out a number that doesn't mean anything, but a very small percentage, I would say, safely, don't really care. And so you would have to be even smaller of a percentage to care about commentary on those things that are going on in 05. And really, really thorough, intensive commentary like what I do. So, I mean, the realm of possible patronage for the projects that I'm involved with, I understand in a very stark contrast to someone like djkaktus and someone like Rounderhouse and their philosophies in approaching why they write and what they write. I understand that this is really not going to be, commercially successful. That's really not why I'm doing this. I'm having a good time doing what I'm doing, and I really enjoy doing this. Honestly, this is one of my favorite ways to spend my time, aside from just being with my family. And there's something about the fact that I'm in such an incredibly specialized and incredibly minute group demographic of people who share a like-mindedness in this. I actually kind of like that quite a lot. Yeah, it means that I'm never going to be like commercially successful, maybe, but there's some sort of like achievement, in getting so specialized and so niche that you're probably one of the few people. I mean, I'm the only person who's doing this kind of stuff, on the internet. So there's something to be said for that, I think.
I went through the forums a lot. I just kind of lurked, and after a while, I just got to the point where I wanted to give it a go. I had some ideas, and so I did. And with the that was good for me. I really the wiki kind of showed up at a time in my life that I really needed something like this.
Yeah,
and
it's funny how that works.
Being able to contribute in that way,
me too,
like, in a creative way in that zone, was
a lot of people,
a huge
I think,
boon to me at the time. I was in a pretty rough spot for a couple of years. And just after I left college, I was working. I wasn't happy.
I was working at night, which is just so difficult to do. Your body never gets used to it. I don't care how long you do it. And so that's how I stumbled across SCP Wiki stuff.
I was, in a pretty dark spot, but the Wiki was there, and it was something I could do, and it was something that I found that I was pretty good at, and I really enjoyed writing in that, within that the confines of what is kind of acceptable on the Wiki. I found that.
Yeah, that's weird that he said that, because once again, djkaktus is instrumental in moving the genre very, very far away from what it is, from itself. In fact, later we'll get to a quote of his that says, if he can get more upvotes, he doesn't care about the rules of the format. So this is a weird thing to hear him say.
To be like a really interesting challenge, right? And so I've been here ever since. So I guess.
And that's a great point, because once again, I'll sound like a broken record, but it's much, much harder. It's much more of a challenge. You're a much better writer if you can stay within the rules, the definition of containment fiction. It's pretty easy, to appeal to a lot of people if you exit it, and things like Dr. Bob should be the indication for that. The SCP Wiki's production and content is somewhere obviously between where I am and where Dr. Bob is. But once again, like I said last time, they are continuously making navigational decisions in the direction of something like Dr. Bob.
Technically, I have been in the zone of the Wiki for almost 10 years. But as far as being a member, I've been a member for just over 7.5.
Wow, that is crazy.
Yeah, I know. It's a really long time, yes. I mean, when I look back on it, it's kind of crazy because, it definitely does not feel like it's been that long. But in all seriousness, it has been the vast majority of my 20s.
Here's what I want to know. Would djkaktus be writing if upvotes weren't part of this? He was at one point, right? At one point, he didn't have any upvotes, and he was writing. Would he do it now? Has it changed him that much?
I have spent as a member and an author on the SCP Wiki. And that's kind of a crazy thing to hear myself say. You know what I mean?
I can imagine, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in one sense, I'm really anti-djkaktus. But it's nothing personal. I really, I'll make fun of the guy. I'll mock and ridicule the guy, sure. But, it's really nothing personal, because if you didn't have djkaktus, there's always going to be that next person who realizes that they have the most upvotes. And, of course, you're not going to get that in someone like Dr. Gears, who has too much maturity, intellectual discipline, and, a correct spiritual compass to let that go to his head, unlike djkaktus. But there was likely going to be somebody like djkaktus. If it wasn't him, it was going to be somebody else. So in that sense, the philosophical disagreements that you and that certainly I might have with someone like djkaktus, he's more of a placeholder. He's more of a figurehead. That philosophy would be there without him, and someone else would just take its take its figurehead place with if it wasn't him. So in that sense, it's really not that personal. I'm sure djkaktus is a fine guy. I'm sure he's a relatively moral person. Might be fun to get a beer with. Like if we were in the same room, I wouldn't try to be hostile to the guy. And I'm not saying that because he's just probably a lot bigger than me. I could quote Colt here, but I won't. But yeah, I mean, it's nothing truly personal. It's just totally philosophical, and it's the extent to which you don't realize that your philosophy, as it is entwined with your personality, is affecting those around you and defining things like the SCP Wiki.
It's really cool, though. Nice. What was it like when you wrote your first article?
These questions, man.
First, I mean, like first.
Were these questions submitted by like
well, my first article is
kindergartners?
My first article is still up.
Really?
If you can believe it, it has somehow survived. It's
Ugh.
SCP-2812.
Once again, Randomini
Echoes of
takes
Yesterday.
he like
Oh,
deflects
man,
all these
it's so
dumb
funny to
questions.
even think about
He's
the
like,
difference between then
let
and
me
now,
ask you the
because
questions.
my-
I have my
you know,
own
it's
questions.
I've gotten to a point now.
And there's we'll get to it maybe one day, but in the Randomini interview, he like there's a list of questions that this guy sends him, and he just goes bam, 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 bam. Okay, we're done. Because these are
that I kind of have a pattern like
Ugh.
when I get to writing.
these are
things for the
painful
wiki.
questions.
In general, it takes me longer.
I do not envy people like djkaktus to have to. I don't know how often he goes on shows like this, but I mean, Jesus, I mean, no. It's a good thing I'm not in his shoes, because if I was in his spot, I would probably wouldn't be very good podcast guest.
Not for sure, because I'm trying to do different things.
Wouldn't
I'm
work
really
out
trying
well.
To be more thoughtful about the things that I write and do more work on the back end to make them better when they finally get on the wiki. But very early on, it also took me a little while for most of those articles.
Yep, he just implicitly and indirectly admitted that for a while for him it was more about quantity over quality, and that's kind of what I'm talking about.
Because I had no idea what I was doing. My very first article, I decided, like, I had a couple of different ideas, like things that I wanted to try out, but it was tricky for me to, I wanted to do it in such a way that, I had resources to pull from. Like when you're on the wiki, for example, everything on the wiki is licensed under Creative Commons.
Not
which is great.
necessarily,
You're talking about a collaborative
although it
writing
is now,
project,
thanks
but,
to the
it also,
religious
you
zealotry
are
of the
limited in
licensing
things that you
team.
can pull in because you can't use resources that are also not.
It's funny when you have something like the SCP-173 image removal. It really says more about the people. They're really trying harder to express to others that they totally understand the very nuanced and complicated points of detail when it comes to something like Creative Commons and licensing. The removal of the SCP-173 image is more about that than it is anything else. It's more about self-flattery for these people and their understanding.
Or that are not also within licensed under Creative Commons, right? So, like, pictures are a big one. Like, early on, I had no idea where to get images from. I wasn't very good at Photoshop, so I just took pictures of the town that I worked in and used those in my first article. I figured I would write kind of about what I knew, write about the town that I was working in at the time. And so I wrote a story
It's
about
good advice.
Some of those like small towns in Indiana that time has forgot, and people are generally kind of moving away from and moving out of. And the story was about that and about the people who are kind of left there after the fact. And it's been such a long time now. I can't tell you exactly where my head was the whole time, but I can tell you for sure it was kind of a harrowing process. The wiki is much nicer now than it used to be, and not to say that it was a nasty place back then. There were already a lot of people doing really good work to kind of change the culture of the wiki and turn it from less of a den of bastards to like a cool nightclub of bastards.
So that's pretty telling. So he didn't mean much by it, but we can read into it quite a lot. It turned in from a den of bastards to a den of nightclub of cool bastards. And really that cool cultural trajectory, I think, says more than he thinks. Because, it's one thing to have a toxic environment where people are like just really mean to you for no reason. But, if it means an abundance of flattery or, a healthy dose of really curt criticism, I think I'd go with the really curt criticism, because both of them can be poisons. It's just that one, you get a really good product out of it, and the other, you get essentially an emotional daycare, which is what SCP Wiki is, and particularly the Twitter sphere of SCP.
And so, I received a lot of great criticism on that first article. I worked with, a couple people who I ended up being pretty good friends with in the years following that, on that first one. And I remember when I got it up, getting feedback has always been like the reason that I am so excited about posting things. It's like I feel like
Oh, come on, man. Don't do that. We all know that the most exciting thing for you is praise. In fact, that's this emotional daycare that's what it's all about. The whole thing is geared so that people don't have to approach the problems with their writing anymore. The whole thing is geared towards not having to listen to or not have to come face to face with the problems of their own writing that may be criticized. That's the opposite of what the SCP Wiki is about now.
a lot of people get this impression because of
And it's actually quite evident in DJ Cactus's own reactions. If you go and look at his articles, I would recommend maybe 4444 or his megalomania, his 5K entry. I mean, just look at his responses to people's criticisms there.
I'm the guy with all the upvotes, which is cool. But the upvotes don't really mean anything at this point. Comments are.
Well, part of that is true, and that DJ Cactus has sort of attained that billionaire level of upvotes where you don't really care about money as much anymore. There is a certain point at which you pass a threshold of care and concern when you just have just way too much money. You don't really care about it anymore in some ways. That's kind of where he is. But he'll talk about it a little later, basically, that I'll let him say it later. Don't worry about it.
Way more valuable than upvotes. Seeing people respond to things that you've written or things that you've created in general, I'm sure you feel the same way. I think a lot of content creators will say the same thing. Even if it's negative criticism.
So I have a question. If comments are more valuable than upvotes, then why does everyone tout their upvote totals? Why don't they have similar metrics for total comments? I've always thought that comments are more valuable than upvotes. That's pretty consistent with what my message has been for 4 years. And in fact, if you look at what I've done with my own writing, I've consistently left places that have, those numerical metrics, those numerical proxies of self-worth in place, and continuously retreated into forms of writing and platforms of writing whereby really it's just the comments, And there's some flaws with that too. It's got its own problems, trust me. But yeah, I mean, so I think that what he's saying is true. It rings a little hollow when you want to say that in the context of, first of all, his history, which he's not, anybody can rise above their history. But it's just interesting to hear him say these things. And certainly if you have that mentality in the context of the SCP Wiki, it just rings so hollow. It's just not true at all. People are fixated on upvotes, and people like Placeholder McD, Harry Blank, there's a whole school of people now that are involved in or hug around the edges of Neo Lol Foundation who, by no coincidence, have a direct correlation with how involved they are with something like Neo Lol Foundation and how hostile they are to any negative reception or criticism of their works. You should really check that out. Anyways, so we're about 17 minutes in, and this has been a fun time. I really appreciate it. I hope you'll keep listening. This will be all the recording that I do for today, but I should get back to it in the next couple days. We'll try to finish this podcast. This is Lack of Lepers. See you then.